Welcome to episode 1, Truck Case Mentor. I'm Fred Burkey. Today we're going to talk about how to frame your case to appeal to a judge and jury. So let's get into it. I use framing to describe the process of selecting the focus of your arguments. Framing is important because you can easily get lost in a truck case. There's often 30,000 documents or more in a truck case. And the first place to start is not necessarily where you might assume. Facts often involve many different vehicles, many different defendants. There's a mass confusion of facts, and actually the defense wants it that way. Because the more confusion there is in a case, the more the jury is apt to say no. So it's very critical to find the right place to focus your arguments and your emotional impact to a jury, because ultimately juries are making a decision not necessarily on the facts, but how they feel about the facts. So where to choose that focus is absolutely critical. So you're going to want to find arguments that resonate with your jurors and your audience. And that can either be the judge or, when you get to trying the case, the jurors. Framing can be applied to hearings, mediation, and trials. In fact, many attorneys assume that, for example, if you're arguing motions in front of your judge, that a judge is only going to want to hear legal arguments, stoic, with no life. And in fact, depending on your judge, they might very well be very interested in hearing a compelling story. So framing can help you find that place to tell facts in your case and bring them to life. So I once represented a young family who was run off the road by a tractor trailer. The truck driver kept going and left the scene, and he was followed by a witness who had to keep pace with him at close to 80 miles an hour, frantically calling 911 to see if she could get help. Later, when I argued the case in front of the judge, I was one of maybe 10 cases that were queued up that morning in argument. And I watched the judge as he listened to the other attorneys argue their cases. And I could just tell he wasn't involved. He wasn't animated. He kind of was leaning back in his chair and looking up like we often see judges do from time to time. So I decided to take a different approach. I decided to tell a story. And how do you tell a story? You put everything in the first person. You sequence the events in chronological order. You add emotional context to the facts that you describe. And then you lead to an ultimate conclusion. I did that with the judge. And as I started, he looked up in his chair and he leaned forward. Unlike the other cases he'd been listening to, he became engaged with my case and automatically started peppering me with questions. I realized that I was able to reach him on a level that the other attorneys hadn't, because I had decided to try to focus the case and frame it in a way that matched his need to hear engaging facts. In the end, I won the motion and ultimately the case. So you decide the emotional context of your audience, I guess, by first focusing on reversing roles with them and understanding what their perspective is. There's several different ways you can do that. One of the ways I like best was something I learned at Trial Lawyers College by Jerry Spence, which is to understand the different emotional things that are going on with your audience. It could be a witness, it could be your judge, it might even be a defense attorney. A lot of times there's a technique you can use. It's called the chairback method. One chair, for example, behind me might represent the most immediate emotion that someone might be feeling, which is a lot of times anger or frustration, especially when, let's say, a deponent, let's say a defendant in a deposition. First thing he's going to be feeling is anger or frustration by being placed in that position of having to answer really tough questions. Then behind that is another emotion. There's always going to be several different emotions that any particular person's going to be feeling at one time. The second emotion in that case might be anxiety. He might be feeling anxious that you'll get to the truth, and the truth might have severe consequences for his company. There might even be a chair behind that, and actually there always is. The third chair might be something like he's considering the impact of what might happen to his business if there's a large verdict. So choosing which chair, emotional focus to craft your argument can yield really valuable results in the end, because at that point you're deciding what's the most important place to craft your argument. The whole process of framing, and the reason why it's so darn important, is because you're going to be seeking to not overwhelm your jury or your decision maker, can be the judge, with just the mass amount of facts that any given truck case is going to generate. In a typical truck case, for example, you can oftentimes have 36,000 or 50,000 documents. You often have many different parties in a truck case because the motor carrier might be engaging with a shipper might be engaging with a broker, all of which is transported by a driver, and each of these can have separate entities and separate defendants. So you can have thousands of documents, multiple defendants, um, and several different theories of liability, all of which, if not carefully managed, can overwhelm and confuse a jury. And a confused juror is always going to say no. It's just human nature. So the absolute key and the focus should be, and hence the name, on obtaining clarity. Clarity and precision coupled with a good story, a compelling story that matches the emotional content, emotional context of your audience, in this case the jury, is going to lead to a yes more often than not. Jurors respond to stories because stories allow us to make sense of complicated facts. So the place to start your story and end your story and having clarity in telling the story is absolutely key. One of the things that I learned from Trial Lawyers College is a group called The Moth, which is a really great podcast, I believe on NPR. And they do open mics and they teach people, ordinary people who are not otherwise storytellers, how to create compelling stories. And it always starts with there's an inciting event, perhaps in this case, the truck crash. And then ultimately, a series of events occur that cause a change. And then about that change usually comes a guide that will lead them through the story, which is you, the trial attorney, and ultimately leading to a conclusion called the story arc. So anything that doesn't fit in the story arc gets tossed. And obtaining that clarity in what is included in your story arc and what should not be included is also a really important part of framing. Here are the takeaways. Understand the emotional context of your audience. Focus the arguments that resonate with your jury. Present your facts in the form of a story. Where appropriate, use in hearings and even mediations. So if you got any more questions, just reach out to me. I'm happy to provide whatever information I can at fred@truckcasementor.com.